Well, good morning. Learned a couple of things walking in here. First of all, for your information, Debbie and I both celebrated birthdays in February, and I was feeling pretty old when I walked in here until I met Gary and Barb. Debbie and I both turned 60, but they're 65. So I'm feeling pretty young. Both this month, right? So, happy birthday. Barb, happy birthday! Okay. Just want to make sure she heard me. And then I'm standing in the back, and I won't mention names, but Tom Grunnert was there. He's my witness. And somebody came in and said they were disappointed because they heard there was a potluck and they didn't smell any pot this morning. And I thought, in this day and age, we're going to have to think of a new name for that event in churches, or people are going to start coming for the wrong reasons with legalization and all that stuff. So we might want to think about that. Out in Kansas, they always called it a covered dish dinner. So maybe that's something I can throw your way. And I really appreciate the hearing the announcement about thinking ahead about where outreach is going. This is not going to be funny, okay? I'm going into the serious mode now. That has always been, from day one, our desire is to plant a church out in this area that reached out with the gospel. And I just want to encourage you. I love that banner right there because it brings me back to Isaiah 58, where it says, as we involve ourselves in mercy ministry, and ministering mercy to those in need in our communities and across the world, your light is going to break forth. That's God's promise. So whatever you do, bathe your ministries in extending mercy to others, because God promises that's what's going to make our evangelism, our outreach, more effective. So that's just a little side note. This morning I wanted to give you an update. So that's kind of my missionary mode, but I can't step out of pastor mode totally. So we're going to look at some passages of scripture that kind of lead into what I want to be talking about or show you about our ministry. Just a minute, I have to get all my goodies out here. There are two instances in the first 5 books of the Bible that talk about God providing water for the Israelites from a rock. And I think to me, they're very interesting because though they look very similar, they have very different results. The first one is found in Exodus chapter 17. If you want to turn there, you may. I'm going to read just a portion of that in a moment. But this is the instance early on in the nation of Israel as they're exodusing from Egypt. And this is even before the 10 Commandments were given. That happened in Exodus chapter 20. But on the way to the mountain, the people ran out of water. And they started complaining to Moses. This is one of those instances, oh, we should have stayed in Egypt. We had it so good there. Yeah. And Moses takes the issue to the Lord. And then in Exodus chapter 17, verses 5 through 7, we read these words. The Lord said to Moses, pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I'll stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? So the Israelites were grumbling, as we read through those first 5 books of the Bible, we see this is a rather habitual thing that they involve themselves in. And they were very short in their memory because they forgot what it was like being slaves in Egypt, because every time they grumbled, it seemed like saying, oh, we had it so good back there. We had leeks and onions. Why leeks and onions were so important to them, I don't know. Maybe manna wasn't all that spicy, but we come to this instance. And Moses saying, God, I don't know what to do here. I don't have water enough to give to these people. And God shows Moses what to do. And he did exactly what God showed him to do, and God provided. Later in the book of Numbers, and this is toward the end of the Israelites wandering around in the wilderness. Remember, they had to wander around for 40 years so an entire generation could die off because they refused to go into Israel the first time God brought them to the Jordan River, and they said, oh, they're too big for us, they're too big. And Joshua and Caleb tried to convince them that we can do this thing, but they all turned against them. And so then that time of wandering, toward the end of that time, they again came to a point where they had no water. And they again came to Moses grumbling, you're such an evil, awful person for taking us out of Egypt. And the Lord again showed up. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give them drink to the congregation and their cattle. Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, hear now, you rebels. Shall we bring water out for you out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank and their livestock. There's an interesting difference in these stories, and I personally believe that the difference that I was taught as a little one, growing up in Sunday school, might not be the biggest problem in this story. The obvious difference is this. God told Moses this time, go talk to the rock. Moses hit it with a stick, and the water came out. And what I was taught growing up is, see, Moses disobeyed. He was supposed to just talk to the rock and not hit it with a stick. Well, God didn't really say don't hit it with a stick. He did say to speak to the rock, and Moses did do that. And maybe that was part of the issue. I'm not sure. But I think there's a bigger part of the issue that became the problem for Moses. Because as a result of this incident, Moses was not allowed to enter the promised land. This is something Moses had been looking forward to for more than 40 years. And he had worked hard, and he had put up with a lot with these Israelites, and he was really looking forward to finally seeing God provide. But he missed out. And I think if we continue reading in Numbers, we see what I believe is the bigger problem, the bigger issue at hand. It wasn't so much hitting the rock with a stick. That obviously wasn't too big an issue, because God did still let the water come out, and he actually told Moses the first time to do that. But let's look at verses 12 to 13. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. These are the waters of Meribah, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy. God pointed out to Moses the problem in those verses, to both Moses and Aaron, in fact. It says, because you did not believe in me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Moses did not get to enter the promised land because he, in this instance, did not uphold God as holy. What does holy mean? Holy means separate. Holy means different. Holy means other. God is so different, so other than who we are. And that's what his holiness is all about. And Moses was not careful in this instance to keep that difference in the eyes of the people. And I think it comes across when he says, back in verse 10, hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock? He didn't say, should God bring water for you out of this rock? But he encroached upon the office of the Lord in this instance as the provider for Israel by using that word we. Now, I don't know if he was tying himself to the Lord, saying, we, God and I, are bringing you this water, Or if it was even worse than that, he was saying, Aaron and I are bringing you water. But in either case, God was not glorified for what he was doing. And that is what Moses was accused of by God, and that accusation being the reason for his not being able to go into the promised land. Deuteronomy 34, later on. Let me back up a minute. Back in Numbers, he says, you're not going to be able to see, or you did not keep me holy in the eyes of the people of Israel. Later on, we read in the book of Numbers and in Deuteronomy that Aaron was taken up to a mountain and he died there. And he did not get to see the promised land. Later on, the same thing happens with Moses. And that's found for us in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Right before the Israelites actually do enter the promised land, this conversation happened between God and Moses. Go up this mountain of Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, opposite Jericho, and view the land of Canaan. So God gave him a chance to see the land from a mountaintop across the river, which I'm giving to the people of Israel for a possession. And die on the mountain which you go up, and be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died in Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people. Because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel, at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel. God's about his holiness. The Bible talks about God, and it uses a characteristic to describe him that we're often uncomfortable with, and that is that God is a jealous God. I think that's what this is talking about. God is a jealous God. God does not want to share his glory with anyone else. And it's not because God is some sort of angry, selfish, egocentric deity sitting up in heaven. It's because he knows that people need to be drawn to him. They don't need to be drawn to us. The people of Israel didn't need to be drawn to Moses. They needed to be drawn to God. And that's why God is a jealous God, because he knows that people don't need to be drawn to Pastor Tom. They need to be drawn to Jesus Christ. And Pastor Tom's a nice guy and all, and I mean, he even bought me breakfast this past week. He's a great guy. But knowing Pastor Tom isn't going to help them one lick when this life is over. People need to be drawn to Jesus Christ, and that's why God is jealous for his glory. His glory is that which attracts us to him, draws us to him, and he wants us to know him. And we need to, there's some New Testament parallels for this same truth. There's a couple passages in the book of Acts that kind of, they stand in opposition to one another. The first one is found in Acts chapter 12, and it's an instance when Herod, the king of Israel at the time, the king appointed by Rome, he was giving a speech, and all the people wanting to praise Herod said, "Oh, this is the voice of a God, not of man." Do you remember what happened to Herod? It says he was eaten by worms. Instantly he died and he was eaten by worms. Later in the book of Acts, Paul and Barnabas are preaching, and they too are being proclaimed by the people as gods. In fact, Paul they called Hermes or Mercury, one of the gods of that time that were held in high esteem. Barnabas was referred to as Zeus and Jupiter. And do you remember what Paul's immediate response was? He got right up in front of those people and said, whoa, stop. We're just people like you are. Completely different result. Herod was willing to share in the glory of being a god, and God showed Herod who he was. Paul and Barnabas said, "Oh, not us." And there was nothing negative that happened to Paul and Barnabas. In fact, their ministry actually increased. It's kind of like what Peter talks about in chapter 3 of 1 Peter, in verse 15, when he says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. Set God aside as holy. Use your life to make sure people see that God is holy, and then be ready to give them an answer. When that opportunity comes, make sure you're not saying, well, it's because I'm a pretty good guy. Debbie and I said it when we left for Africa way back in 2007, that we always wanted the ministry that God has called us to abound to his glory, and we didn't want people to say, oh, aren't the McIntyres wonderful people? Because we're not, quite frankly. And quite frankly, people don't need to be drawn to us. They need to be drawn to Christ. We want the love of Christ to be the thing that is seen through the ministry that we're involved in. We want to do this because we don't want to miss out on the blessings that God has, quite frankly. And as well as the fact that, like I've already said, people need to be drawn to Christ, not to us. That's why our mission statement, as a mission, if you've been reading our newsletter, this is not news to you, is summed up in 8 simple words. We exist to glorify God by loving Jesus through mercy ministry. We want God to be glorified. We want to do that, like this banner says, by loving Jesus. We love Jesus when we do it to some of the least of these, when we extend mercy. We want that to happen because ultimately, at the end of all of this, we want God to be the one people say, look what God is doing in Africa. And that's just kind of a precursor to what I want to share with you about what God is doing in Africa. The first thing that I'd like to share with you this morning has to do with our building. Oh, that's already on. Oh, there's our logo. Isn't that pretty? We have a building now, and we've been able to watch this building over the past 6 months. It's been under construction. Go from where they were trenching to pour footings in the ground. They built there was the footings, and then what do they call the part that's just under the ground, Bill? The foundation? Is that all it is? I wanted a fancier name, but anyway. To the point where they built the deck for the first floor. Why are we not moving? There we go. They were watering the sand there. That's how they actually did it all. These guys work like animals. I'm sorry, I don't mean to call them animals, but they just work hard. It was 90 plus degrees the whole time we were there watching these guys work. Me too. I think we need to pause on this particular picture for a while just to show you that I am working very hard. Actually, that wheelbarrow didn't move an inch. I did pick it up. All the guys were standing around as I got my picture taken, then I set it right back down, and they started laughing. But they do. They walk it up there, they pour it out by hand, up that little ramp, and then they started building the walls. This is for the first floor of the building. Got to the point where they call it up to the lintels, the tops of the windows and doors. And then they had to frame that all in and then pour all those. And then they got it to this point. And when I left, this is what it looked like. We left about 4 weeks ago, end of February. So it was at this point. It's about a little over 2,000 square foot footprint, but it's going to be a 2-story building. And so then they took all these bamboo poles and had to build the deck for the second floor pour. And so then they did all that work to get ready for the second floor. And when I left, they were just, this had not happened yet. So they did lay all this steel work out to get the second floor poured. And I don't know if you can see very well what that is. It's not very bright. But that's a concrete pump. But still, they're bringing all the concrete in wheelbarrows, putting it into that pump, pumping it up onto the second floor, and then pouring out and leveling out that, which is now the second floor. So we have a second floor. That's got a cure for, they say, 2 to 3 weeks before they can start walking on it. But they'll start sometime, probably a week from tomorrow, they'll start building the outside walls because they don't have to stand on the floor to do that. But we're excited about this. We're excited to see a floor, a second floor. And we're excited because God did this thing. This is not something we had the finances for. We had no money. People would ask us, well, when are you going to build your building? Well, and we kind of felt sheepish and awkward, and, well, we don't know because we really don't have any money. But here it is. This happened by God's hand through another impossible thing. It largely happened through one wealthy person's giving. Probably gave us between $150,000 and $200,000. And I say it's impossible because of the verses that we see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, that all say basically the same thing. It's when Jesus was interacting with the rich young ruler, and he told the rich young ruler, give everything you have away to the poor, and the rich young ruler walked away sad. And the disciples asked Jesus, well, because Jesus says it's impossible. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter heaven. And the disciples asked Jesus, well, who can then? Who can go to heaven? Because back then, as is true too often today, especially in Ghana, although it's been exported to Ghana from here, we have that wealth and prosperity kind of mentality. People are wealthy because God has blessed them. And we see God's blessing on people because of their great wealth. And Jesus was teaching them it's just the opposite, people. Wealth isn't necessarily a blessing. It's impossible for that rich man to let go of his wealth and trust God instead. And so the disciples said, well, who can then? And that's when Jesus said these words. Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. What Jesus was saying was, I can even touch the heart of a rich man and make him generous toward the kingdom. And that is exactly what God did. And I'm not saying he gave all the money, but he gave a good portion of that money, and then other people, as that money was coming in, kind of rallied around. But we watched God do what the New Testament says can happen, that God can touch the heart of a very wealthy man. And he did. This is a guy that 3 years ago I didn't even know. We met him accidentally on a trip to Ghana from another ministry was taking, and I was kind of acting like a host because this other ministry didn't have any contacts in Ghana, so I was driving him around, and my wife actually told me not to because she said, you're too busy, you don't have time to do this. And I said, well, I feel like I got to help out. He was on that trip, and as we introduced him to, or that group, they wanted to see what our ministry was all about. As we introduced him to that, God touched his heart. And from never knowing the guy to now being a primary sponsor of what's happening. And we now have enough that we should be able to finish this building and begin on a second one. And I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. So God gave us the building. And I don't want anybody to say, wow, the McIntyres are having a wonderful impact in Ghana because they're already in a building project, blah, blah, blah. God did this thing. This is totally of God. But it's not just buildings. It's also in the children that he gives us opportunity to care for. And by the way, I want to take a little side step right now. Thank you for the project that you were involved in, the dresser and filling a dresser for the children, and largely focusing on one little boy named Michael. Michael is the little boy that came into our care a year ago. He was brought into our care as a hospice child, and we were informed by the doctors that he would probably not live another month. Michael is still alive. I don't know why. The doctors don't know why. Nurses don't know why. And I say this not just that I can't give you an explanation of why he's living. I don't know what God's purpose in his living is. Because quite honestly, we've been praying that God would take him home because he's in a pretty pitiful condition. And yet God has a purpose that he's using and doing through Michael. At the very least, he's introducing us to all kinds of new people. But that's Michael. That was a couple months ago. That's what he looked like when we were there last. He's in a lot of pain. He eats, but it's difficult. That's what he looked like when he first came to us. And obviously, Michael is hydrocephalic. We don't know what the purpose God has in store, but we know this. It's only God keeping him alive, because every doctor that we've interacted with, every nurse that we've interacted with, both within Ghana and those that have come to visit from outside, from here in the U.S., they'll listen to his lungs, they'll listen to his heart and say, oh, he won't last a week. He won't last. He can't last. He's so filled with fluids. And yet God keeps him alive. And I don't know why. I don't know what God's purpose is in this, but at the very least, people are seeing this little boy being loved with the love of Christ through our house parents and the workers that we have. And God is just amazing people with the fact that this little boy keeps holding on. Again, I don't know why. I don't know what the purpose is. Quite frankly, I feel a little bit like Paul talked about in Romans. I don't even know what to pray for anymore for this little guy, because my heart says, Jesus, take him home. And yet, if God has a bigger something in mind, then I don't want to be praying that God would cut that short. So anyway, I share that with you so that I can confuse you in your prayer as well for Michael. But ultimately, it's Jesus in the garden, right? God, nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And that's what we're praying for this little guy. We have other children in our care. This is Abena and James. We've watched these two. Abena came to us very, very ill as a small child. She is HIV positive. She's third stage HIV. For those of you who know much about HIV, the fourth stage is full-blown AIDS. So she came to us in third stage HIV, and yet she is thriving. They're in school. She has a little bit of a tude, as you can see. She's in her formal Ghana wear. They were having a party at school. Again, she was not expected to live this long, and yet God is doing an amazing thing. Doctors don't really know why, but she's doing well. Little James, he was never supposed to walk. He came to us hydrocephalic, much the same as Michael, but he also had a stroke and was really struggling to use his limbs at all. He was better with his hands, but there was just no walking, and he was just never expected to walk. He's walking now. We had a walker for him. And when he first started going to school, he was using that, but then he saw the other kids weren't using one, so he decided he didn't need one either. And he's doing great. He is doing fabulously. But God's at work. God is doing things in these little lives. These are throwaway children. These are children that were abandoned because there was no hope for them, and there were no resources available to take care of them. Why are we being? That's my daughter Jessie, but that's not who we're highlighting here. Next to her is a little boy named Divine. He came to us last year about this time. I'm looking at my wife because she's better at the timetable. As a complete failure to thrive child. They predicted he was between 3.5 and 4 years old at that time. He weighed, do you remember what his weight was at that time? It was less than 10 pounds as a almost 4-year-old. He would not eat. He would not speak. Weren't sure if he could speak. And then God brought last year 3 different teams to Ghana, well, individuals and teams that just started investing in this little guy. And he just blossomed. It was amazing. Just as Christ's love was being poured out to him, all of a sudden he started talking. First he started interacting a little bit, playing. And then he started saying a few words. And then he started eating. And now he eats everything in sight. He runs around. He jumps around. He's a happy little boy. He speaks. He's communicative. Again, God is doing an amazing thing. That's Adjoa. Talk about a tude. That would be her. She's not had a problem eating. She's about 3.5, 4 years old-ish. And she doesn't have the problem Divine had. But she came presenting all kinds of other kinds of issues. There was some suspicion that she had been a subject of female circumcision. And I don't want to go too much beyond that. But she's got some cognitive delays that we think might be CP related. We're not sure. She has 6 toes on each foot. I don't know what that has to do with anything, but she does. But God is, again, we're beginning to see her speaking more, and she goes to a school for special needs children in Ghana. You can be praying for that. These schools in Ghana are very expensive. She's grown up. She's the one that initially my wife wanted for us to adopt again. I told her, no, we're too old for that. At 60, I didn't want to be starting over. Sorry, I'm a grandparent now. But now she's saying, you know what, as we go back, she's just busy. They call her Miss Busy for nothing because she's just busy all the time, just kind of making sure everybody does what she wants them to do. So again, we're seeing great progress in her. This is Yaya. Yaya is another one that we were told she'll never walk. We used to have her in one of those bumble seats, just to help her sit up because she was never going to be able to sit up properly. She now sits in a chair. She's beginning to speak. Every time we walk into the room and just say her name, she just beams like this. And it looks like her legs are strengthening now, and she's beginning to take some steps assisted. So we're just praising the Lord as this little one, who again was a throwaway child, beginning to grow into progress. Whoops, sorry. There. That's Grace. Grace came to us a 1.5 years ago. She has a heart condition that is repairable outside of Ghana. We had an adopted family all lined up, all according to what Ghana said that we needed to do. Wonderful family. It was a pastor and his wife from Virginia they've already got 7 kids. And new administration has come in, and now they said, well, they've got 7 kids, they can't possibly love another one. So that adoption has been put on hold, which means the medical treatments that they were all prepared to give to her have been put on hold, and we're praying for her. But she is growing. Her heart seems to be at least holding its own. She's a delightful young lady. And then we have Faith. She's our newest. She also is HIV positive. And we don't know what God has in store for this little one. But she seems to be doing well, responding well to her treatments, her drugs, therapy that they have her on. But be praying for her. These are the kids that God has given us, that God has entrusted to us, but not just left with us. He's there. He's helping. He's growing these kids. So God has given us a building. God has given us these children, and in both cases, God has stayed very involved because they are where they are. Many of the children that we have shouldn't be alive by human standards or by human understanding, and yet God has shown that he has a different thing in mind, and we're asking God to do more. We're asking God to do more based on, we've recently had to turn away some children because we're just out of space. And that's why we're in a building project and wanting to build multiple buildings. Let me give you one example. This is Kwaku. I was contacted in March by a doctor this month, by a doctor in Ghana that I had met when we were there in February, and said she was wondering if we could help this little guy. 2.5 years ago, he was found buried alive. He has developed or had, we don't know, some serious cognitive delays and some physical disabilities as well. And so the answer to that was simply dig a grave, put him in, bury him. He's been cared for at a Catholic hospital. The nurses have been caring for him for the past 2.5 years, but it's time that they pass him on to someone for a more long term. We'd love to be able to take him, but we just literally don't have the space legally to take any more children into care. And so we're praying that God would, in his grace and mercy, and as he's already shown us he's willing to do, continue to provide, because we do want our facility to resemble that. Right now, is there a pointer on this thing? Yes, there's a little red dot. Right now, that's the building that's being built. But these 3 are just going to be replicates of that, so that in time we should be able to take care of 40 children rather than the 10 we have currently. I only showed you 8 because 2 of the children that we have in care right now have been adopted by our house parents, but they're still in our care. And so we're praying that God will just continue to raise up the resources so that we can get that developed, so that we can say no to fewer and fewer kids. That's our goal. That's our hope. In all of it, though, we want you to understand God is at work in Ghana. And he's allowed Debbie and I to come along and watch what he's doing, so that hopefully we can come back and tell you what he's doing. We are his witnesses. That's really what we feel like our role is. All we can do is just tell you what God is doing. And he's at work. And it's a joy to see. And I invite you to come. Some of you have been there. Not enough of you. You should just all come. We just recently, I didn't bring a picture, rented a house, a 4-bedroom house. Each bedroom has its own bathroom, and it's going to be our guest house. And our partners from Australia are coming at the end of this month. Debbie and I and Jesse are going back to Ghana to help them settle in. They're going to live in the house for the first year at least, and they will be the hostess and the host and hostess for our guest house. Beautiful place. It's about less than a half a mile from our children's home. Easy walk. So it's just a beautiful setup, and we're praising the Lord for that as well. So please keep praying. Keep praying that God will do what only he can do. And keep praying for these little ones, and let's see what God wants to do in the years that are yet to come. Father, I do thank you for this opportunity to share with this church, the church that is, of course, a big part of our hearts because of our involvement in the past with this church and what you've allowed us to be involved with in its early years, and continues to be just heavy on our hearts to see this church thrive and to be effective in sharing the gospel. And one way you've shown us how to do that is just get yourself involved in extending mercy, because people will see that. They'll want to know about it, and it'll give us opportunity to share. Father, we pray that you would accomplish that through this church. And on behalf of West African Mercy Ministries, God, would you continue to work? Would you continue to bless? Would you continue to bring us children that need to be loved, so that not only are they cared for, but a watching community can see what your love looks like. And maybe, just maybe, that will draw them to Christ. That's our hope. That's our prayer. We pray these things in your name. Amen.